As Sandra mentioned, when we look at Paul's journeys, Paul went to Philippi. He spent time there, and we talked about that last week. And then he moved on from Philippi on towards Thessalonica. Thessalonica was our home at St. Paul on the trip that we took for a couple of days. And on the way, we saw some interesting pieces. The tomb of Philip of Macedonia was one piece that we saw. Philip was the father of Alexander the Great. And the discovery of his tomb not too many years ago was an amazing discovery that was just a phenomenal sight that I have no pictures of because we weren't allowed to take pictures. But it was a great sight to be able to see. We saw a monument to and we do have a picture of this, a monument to the Spartan warriors of the Battle of Thermopylae, which are known from the movie 300 warriors that fought and died, and so there was a memorial for that at that place. We drove past an endless number of small villages. Here's an example of one of those. And just astonishing to me, the number of just really small little settlements that we found all along the way. Half of Greece's population lives in Athens. And the other half of Greece's population is mostly in these small villages, just scattered all throughout the country. We did see some significant things in Thessalonica itself. An example is the Cathedral Hagia Demetrios, and a beautiful, beautiful church that typical of many of the cathedrals in Europe. But as far as Paul in biblical times go, we didn't see much in Thessalonica. And part of that's because many of the places where we saw, there's a modern city that's built close to, but not right on top of, the ancient city. So Philippi last week was a really good example of this. There's great ruins of the ancient city of Philippi, and not very far away at all is the modern city of Philippi. But Thessalonica is built directly over the original Thessalonica. The city was originally founded around 350 BC, and it's been in existence ever since then, and they've built on top of itself. So actually, it's a great problem for them right now because they're doing some excavations right now they're trying to build a subway system in Thessalonica. They've been trying to do that for about 15 years, and they're about 8 years behind schedule because every time they put in another shovel, they dig up some more ruins. and then they have an argument. There's a huge piece right now that's been excavated, but it's not open to the public. We were not able to see it. That's got the old city, including the old original street and so on, and they've talked about maybe moving that to a museum, but how do you move a street to a museum? So they've just earlier this year found a way around this problem that they have, but it's going to delay the finishing of the subway by at least 4 more years, and who knows in the next 4 years what else they're going to find that's going to cause another delay. So we don't have much archaeological evidence for life in Thessalonica during biblical times, but we do have quite a bit of textual evidence, and with all of that in mind, we heard today the story of Paul in Thessalonica. And Paul, we know, would have walked from Philippi through the cities that are mentioned in the scripture today and on to Thessalonica on the Via Egnatia. We talked about that last week briefly, that 700-mile road that stretches from east to west in northern Greece. He passed a couple of cities on the way that he apparently maybe stopped at to spend the night, but spent no time in. We have no mention of Apollonia or Amphipolis, any place else in the Bible. And then he arrives in Thessalonica. And he went to the synagogue first in Thessalonica, as he ordinarily would do in his different stops. He preached there, we're told, for 3 weeks, over 3 Sabbaths he preached there, 3 Saturdays. And as with Lydia in Philippi that we talked about last week, we find that Paul had the most success with Greek or Gentile God worshippers, people who were not, strictly speaking, were not Jewish, were not part of the Jewish faith, but were interested in what was going on. And he also had success, particularly with, it sounds like, with women. And then finally, we find that the people who were not persuaded by Paul were not very happy with Paul. You know, again, we have this kind of thing happens pretty consistently with Paul. The people in the synagogue who did not convert to Christianity were not happy. And so, we're told, as today's story wraps up, they formed a mob. They recruited some people to be part of the mob with them. They had a riot and effectively drove Paul out of the city. Now, I want you to notice that this is not a case of Paul inciting a riot. Okay, Paul did not encourage the riot. Paul did not encourage, whether it was in Thessalonica or any place else, he didn't encourage people to resort to this kind of tactic. But when people's ideas are challenged, they tend to react badly. This is certainly true when the person challenging the original ideas is making a really good point, as was the case for Paul. And this is one reason why there have been so many cases, I think, through Christian history of martyrs, of real martyrs. Every great movement really has martyrs. The early Christians certainly were that way. The earliest of Christians, many of them were killed because of their faith. We have story after story after story of that, not only in the Bible, but from extra-biblical sources as well. The Protestant Reformation had many martyrs because of it. People who first wanted everybody to have access to the Bible years and years and years ago, prior to the Protestant Reformation, the plan for the Bible was that it would be held by only the pastors, only the clergy, because the clergy were the only people who really knew what to do with it. So you'd have to have the scriptures interpreted through the clergy person and not accessible to everybody, to read on their own and interpret on their own. And so there were people who were killed because they tried to get the Bible in the hands of the masses instead of just the elite. Stepping outside of the church building to other great movements, the civil rights movement had martyrs. The anti-apartheid movement in South Africa had martyrs. And on, every great movement had martyrs. Within Christianity, counting the martyrs of the world today is tricky business. It's hard to figure out precisely how many people, and in fact the estimates vary widely, but the consensus is that at a minimum 1,200 or so Christians die because of their faith every year in the world. Some of the estimates, which we know are high, but some of the estimates go as high as 100,000 a year. So the truth would be someplace in between. But at least 100, more than 100 a month throughout the world die because of their faith and because of their willingness to share and to live their faith. And I hope that we remember to pray for and to care for those Christians who die because of their faith, because that's significant. That could be us if our situation was different than it is here in the United States. Of course, that's not our situation in the United States. We're fortunate, with all of its imperfections, we don't have to worry here about that kind of hostility because of our faith. We don't have to experience that kind of terror because of our faith. We don't have to worry about going to jail or riots starting because we express what we believe as Christians. But that doesn't mean that we don't have any issues, right? The goal of the persecutions, think about this, the goal of the persecutions was to keep people quiet. The goal of the persecutions, the reason for the martyrs, is to shut down the faith. And you might think what you think, do what you want to do on your own, but at least publicly, the goal of them was to make people of faith quiet. And in that regard, one could argue that our situation in the United States is actually a lot like Paul's situation in Thessalonica. Now, this is not true. I want to be clear. This is not true in every city that Paul visited. This is kind of not unique, but it's a little bit unusual in Thessalonica. But because in some other cities, it was the Romans or the secular government who tried to put Paul in his place. But in this case, that's not true. In this case, it wasn't the Romans, it was the Jews. It was the people in the synagogue who didn't agree with what Paul was teaching. Now, you need to know that one of the accusations that's made against the Bible is that it's anti-Semitic, or at least that there's portions of it that are anti-Semitic. And there's some truth to that. There are some places in the Bible that we read some very negative things written about the Jewish people, painted with a very broad brush. So that, for example, there's places where it says the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus. Not some Jewish people, along with the Romans who actually did the crucifixion, because that was Jewish people would not have been able to actually crucify, but just with a broad brush, and treats the Jewish people as a whole unfairly. So there's truth to that. There's portions that do that. But remember the context. The first Christians were Jewish. The people who wrote those scripture passages, many of them still would have considered themselves to be Jewish. But they would consider themselves to be a sect within the Jewish faith overall that was called Christian. The best maybe modern day example of this would be the Mormon Church today. So the Mormon Church, most of those people who are not of the Christian faith would, when you ask somebody about the Mormon Church, they would say, well, that's a kind of Christian. Just like in the days of Paul, the people who were not Jewish or Christian, they would say, when you ask them what a Christian was, they'd say, well, that's I guess one of those kinds of groups within Judaism. If you ask a Mormon person whether or not they are Christian, Mormons would say that they are Christian, just like those first Christians would say that they were Jewish. But if you ask most Christians that are not Mormon about the Mormon faith, they would say, well, at least those who know about some of the intricacies of the Mormon faith would say, well, it's not a knock against the Mormon faith. It is what it is. But is it Christian? Well, there's enough differences between the Mormon faith and the Orthodox, even broadly speaking, Orthodox Christianity, that it's kind of tough to make the case that the Mormon religion is also Christian. It has its origins within Christianity, but it's far enough apart now that it's probably a separate thing. In fact, in the United Methodist Church, we don't rebaptize people from other Christian faiths. But we do rebaptize somebody who's Mormon, because it's not considered to be part of the Christian faith. In the same way, I want you to hear this, in the same way that it came to pass that Jewish people would say of the early Christians, well, I hear them say that they're Jewish, but look, they've got this Jesus person. This is a different thing than what we're doing here in the Jewish faith. So with all due respect to those who call themselves Christian, they don't fit within the Jewish faith now the way that perhaps they once did. So you hear the comparison. The Jewish people might say or the Christian people might say that they're Jewish, but the Jewish people would not have said of the Christians that they were Jewish. They had gone beyond the Jewish faith enough that was no longer the case. Now, this is what I want you to hear. The fight in Thessalonica was not between people of one faith and people who were of a different faith. It was a conflict between the Jewish people who were now led by Paul and the Jewish people who were not led by Paul. It was a conflict within the same faith. And I want you to think with me for a moment about what happens now here in the United States. It's a largely, certainly not entirely by any stretch of the imagination, but we largely think of ourselves as a nation that's dominated by Christianity. And so what happens, for example, at the Republican National Convention and at the Democratic National Convention? Faith was invoked in both cases, but it was a very different looking faith. What happens in the TV when you go to a Christian TV channel and you watch what the faith is described like on the many of the Christian TV channels or on the Christian radio, and you hear one kind of faith, but then when you go to worship, maybe you hear a different kind of faith. John Shelby Spong has written that we need a new reformation that would effectively redefine what it means to be Christian. Pope Francis has continually increased the tension with the very conservative Catholics, the conservative wing of the Catholic Church. Every day they become more nervous. Here in the United Methodist Church, we're on the brink of schism. Christian leaders on each side of the theological chasm would say of the other that they aren't truly Christian anymore, that they've gone beyond the intentions of the original faith. And here we are, stuck in the middle, just trying to be faithful. And really everybody is, right? The Christian far left, the Christian far right, and everything in between. We're all just trying to be faithful. How do we speak to what we believe to be true when the tension within the faith itself is so high? But that's what we're called to do, nevertheless. And sometimes that's going to put us in a position like those in Thessalonica, where we're very uncomfortable with speaking what we believe. How do you speak to a Christian who is on a different side of the theological spectrum than you are, who's very clear about what it means to be a faithful Christian, when what you would say, if you could, was, gosh, I don't see that as being a faithful Christian at all, or I don't see that as my way, at least, of being a faithful Christian at all. How do we do that? If you ever feel like you're silenced, if you ever feel like you're stuck and you can't say something because your view is so different from somebody else's view, or because they're so firm about their view that you feel like you're just not able to speak, then you know something about what it means to be silenced because of your faith. And that's a hard place to be. But we're still called by God to be faithful to what we believe God's calling us to be and to do and to say, and even to witnessing to the idea that there's a different way of being Christian than what somebody else might perceive. All right, with that in your mind, I want to move now, because Paul doesn't stay in Thessalonica very long. Paul, in this particular case, makes the decision that he needs to move along. Now, that's not always the case. In fact, next week we're going to see that that's not always the case. Sometimes Paul chooses to stick it out, even when things get really rough. But in this case, we have to be brave enough to do what God's calling us to do, even when it goes against the grain. And Paul was remarkably persistent about that. But in this case, Paul decides it's time to move on. And I want to read to you the verses that come right after what Sandra read for us this morning, starting with the 10th verse and going for a couple more. We're told this: as soon as it was dark, the brothers and sisters sent Paul and Silas on to Berea. And when they arrived, they went to the Jewish synagogue. The Berean Jews were more honorable than those in Thessalonica, so you hear some of that bias coming in here. The Berean Jews were more honorable than those in Thessalonica. This was evident in the great eagerness with which they accepted the word and examined the scriptures each day to see whether Paul and Silas's teaching was true. Now, we visited Berea, too, on our trip, and we saw these steps that you'll see here. That is the bema, or the speaker's platform, that tradition says is a place that Paul preached from. This is one that's not as reliable as some of the pictures you saw last week from Philippi and the week before in Athens. But the tradition is that this is the place where Paul preached from. If not the steps, then that part of the city. But I mention Berea not because of Paul's preaching. I mention Berea instead because of what Paul experienced there. Eventually, trouble would find its way to Berea for Paul too. The Thessalonians, Berea is not too terribly far away from Thessalonica, so some of the Thessalonians discovered that Paul had gone to Berea. They gathered up some of their mob, and they even followed him there. So they try to continue to put pressure on him. So eventually that happens. But before that, he was brought to Berea to find a place of sanctuary from the experience in Thessalonica. His followers said, Paul, you got to get out of here. And you got to go to Berea, because in Berea you're going to be received better. In Berea you're going to be able to find a place where you're welcomed and where you can just find sanctuary. You can find rest. You can find restoration. You can find renewal. The people there welcomed him. They weren't threatened by him. They listened to him. And it turns out that many of them converted, but that wasn't the point. They listened to him. They were present with him. And he was able to rest and to be renewed. Doesn't that sound wonderful? After the experience of Thessalonica, where he had to argue and argue and argue and experience the riot, doesn't it sound nice to be able to be in a place where you can just be yourself and you can speak what you want to speak and people are going to hear it? I want to encourage you today to travel with Paul to Thessalonica, to be willing to, in the public sphere, say there's different ways of being Christian. There's different ways of understanding God's will. We're not all of one mind. I want you to be willing to put yourself out there, even if you know that you won't always be treated well because of it. I want you to be able to put yourself out there because people need to hear what you have to say. But I also want to encourage you to travel with Paul to Berea. Because when you are willing to put yourself out there, you need a place where you know you can just be, and you can rest, and you can be renewed. If we're going to be faithful in putting ourselves out there in Thessalonica, we have to be able to find a place where we can be renewed like Berea. And my hope is that St. Paul's here can be, for you, a Berea. It's difficult, maybe even impossible, to be what God calls us to be 7 days a week unless we have that place where we can relax. You're going to be challenged at times. You'll be challenged to think differently. Here at St. Paul's, you'll be challenged to think differently. You'll be challenged to respond differently than you have, perhaps. You'll be asked to work with people who you might not ordinarily work with, to stretch your faith, to stretch your mind. But at the same time, it's also a place where you should feel safe. You should feel peace. That's what we want, at least. And a place where you can find encouragement, where you can find companionship, where you can find relief. That's what the pioneers of St. Paul's 33 years ago were aiming for, I think, in part. And that's what we'll continue to try to build in the future, a place where we can be called from this place to go out into the world and to share our faith in all of its forms, but a place where we can also come back to and find relief. I've asked you the last couple of weeks to consider being with Paul on Mars Hill, sharing faith to a culture that needs to hear that. But I ask you today to share your faith with other Christians and to make sure that you come back to this place to find rest and relief and encouragement and hope and companionship. And I hope that's a vision that we can all share for what this church might be. Whether we all think alike or not, a place where we can be together and love God together and love each other together. Loving and seeking and serving, as our mission statement declares. I invite you to turn to God now in a time of prayer, and you might pray silently for just a moment before we hear Sandra lead us in a prayer together.